Remember that quote we read a few minutes ago from C.S. Lewis? The church exists for nothing else but to draw men unto Christ, to make them little Christ. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself, are simply a waste of time. God became man for no other purpose. If we aren't reaching people for Jesus, what's the point? That's my short version. What's the point? Anybody ever heard of Reggie Joiner? He wrote this book called Orange, and I want to read you a little bit from it real quick. We have a few minutes here. I just want to read you a couple of quotes. He talks about culture. That quote I read from C.S. Lewis, he quotes it in here too, and actually says other quotes from different leaders, and they all kind of say the same thing. They all agree on that fact that we need to be, in order for us, the church, our existence, our purpose is only to make little Christ, is only to show the world that Jesus loves them. That's our purpose. That's our existence. All right, so he says the last book of the Bible takes this concept a step further and gives us powerful metaphor for the church's purpose. Anybody ever read in Revelation and you're kind of like, what is this? Anybody remember the story of the lampstand in the tabernacle? When John writes in the opening chapter of Revelation that Jesus compares the church to a lampstand, we are giving a strong reminder of the church's responsibility. Anyone reading these words in the early church would have immediately understood the image of the lampstand. In Exodus, it was one of the few pieces of furniture that God commanded to be put in the tabernacle. God gave specific instructions on how the lampstand was to be built, the kind of oil it should burn, where it was to be placed, and what it existed to illuminate. The Exodus passages are rich with descriptions about the lampstand and can give any church insight into its purpose. For example, except for God's presence in the inner sanctum of the tabernacle, the lampstand provided the only source of light within the tabernacle walls. It's also interesting that one of the priest's primary jobs was to make sure that the light of the lampstand never burned out. One of the most intriguing details about the lampstand was where it was placed, next to the table that held the shewbread. The loaves known as the bread of presence. The lampstand was positioned strategically to do one thing, cast its light on the table and on the bread that represented God's provision and presence. For generations, the lampstand of the tabernacle stood to highlight the object that best represented God's goodness and provision, the same object that Jesus would one day use to symbolize his own body. When he said, take this bread, that's what he was using. The church exists to shine a light onto the darkness, a light that highlights God's goodness and reveals God's Son, in order that the world can understand and know him. We could dig deeper into the symbolism, but really that explanation alone gives us enough to think about for a lifetime. He goes on to say, I recently reread John's challenges to the 7 churches. Anybody ever read those books and you're just like, ow, ow? Anybody but me? Or maybe you were thinking, haha, those guys really, really were messed up. They really deserved a good whooping. I mean, maybe I'm just thinking that way, but, it shows a highlight on some of the ways I think. Anyway, I recently reread John's challenges to the 7 churches, or the 7 lampstands in Revelation. Everything seemed to make more sense to me in the light of the lampstand's purpose in the tabernacle. Every warning, admonition, and instruction seemed to indicate that God was concerned about the church losing its influence and impact. Everything about these churches, their teaching, their practices, and their work was challenged for one reason. They were losing their effectiveness as God's lights to their communities. They got preoccupied with other things. They were losing their effectiveness. They moved the lampstand. It's important to note that the lampstand in the tabernacle did not cast broad light, illuminating everything in the tabernacle. The focus of the beam was specifically on the bread of the presence. Likewise, the church is not called to illuminate everything. Its light should be concentrating on showing others who God is. Sometimes we get distracted. Anybody have ADD? You're like, squirrel. You just think of all sorts of things, right? We've been that way as the church sometimes. We just get on these other things that they're not bad things. Getting behind a good politician who believes in something good is not a bad thing. Believing that's the only way to change the world, you're moving your lampstand. Getting behind boycotting something, well, that's never really worked. So there's other ways to show your message. There's other ways to be a light. For church leaders, the application is not complicated. Our jobs are clear. We have to keep the wicks trimmed, the lights burning, and the lampstand in its proper place. If the light begins to dim, we must immediately move into action. God's intention is for the church to be placed strategically, say strategically, in culture in order to show himself to the world. Strategically in what? Culture. In this culture. Anytime the church becomes ineffective in its role to illuminate Christ, it must rekindle and reinvent itself around its core purpose. We've done that several times. Churches do that. Churches repackage their message. It's when churches change the message that things get broken. You guys follow me? Is it a bad thing for a church to change some lighting, maybe change the dress code, maybe do some cooler music? Is that a bad thing? No, it's not. Is it a bad thing for us to water down the gospel so that we can try to reach more people? Yeah. What does that do? It creates an ineffective, powerless body. So I'm going to read one more thing. He was a family minister director at North Point Community Church for several years. He was one of the founding members of it. You guys know North Point Community Church? It's Andy Stanley's church. So he was on staff there, and he says this: I recall a number of times during my life as a leader in the church in which I would look around after becoming distracted by irrelevant issues and realize we had drifted. Why is the lampstand over there? What are we doing fighting with these people? Why am I so anxious about things that really don't worry God? I have a hard time imagining him getting worked up about too many of those things. I sincerely doubt that God is in heaven frantically saying, oh no, J.K. Rowling is writing another book. Or calling all angels, Disney is going to let those people into their park? I need you to rally some Christians to boycott. No. Can you imagine God saying that? No, he says this: I can't imagine God pointing at the lampstand and saying to us, who moved the lampstand? What are you doing? Why are you focused on that other stuff? Bring it back over here where it belongs. Show them who I am. Show them who I am. In John 12:32, Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. It's really a simple thing. You want to reach your world? Lift Jesus up. You want to change your community? Lift Jesus up. You want to change your culture? Lift Jesus up. Standing in front of an abortion clinic and calling the people sinners and telling them they're going to hell is not going to change a thing. Lifting Jesus up, loving people, opening your hearts to people who you couldn't imagine would ever be in your heart. That can change your world.